Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to our butterfly talk that we have every 2 weeks. Today we have Evrim Karacetin from Turkey, from the university, Erciyes University, and she is going to talk today of a really interesting topic of livestock, butterflies, and drought. So how that is affecting. Evrim is working in the environmental department, mainly on impact environmental in agriculture and affecting biodiversity, and more focused on butterflies. So I'm sure we will learn a lot and listen really interesting things that Evrim has to tell us. So Evrim, when you want, you could start sharing the presentation.
First of all, thank you all for coming. Today, I would like to talk about a little bit on my experiences of summer 2021. And what we observed mostly was how livestock and butterflies are interacting and how drought is influencing. This is, by the way, no scientific presentation. We mostly did some observations, we collected some data, but the area, the most dominant factor in the area always appears to be livestock, as quite a lot, some of you already visited these sites. So I'd like to tell a little bit of the story of how human beings and their way of living influences the environment and the butterflies. So first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about our field work. This summer, there was a work about forestry department and how biodiversity is influenced by the Forestry Act. And we actually, from my hometown to Erzurum, we went and we did this whole field work in this region. As a team, we had and when we talk about this region, it is interesting in a way that it has very short summers, at most 2 months. So these people, there is no way that they can grow their food. 2 months is really short. So major economy depends on animal husbandry. Main income is through animal husbandry, and this has been going on more than 10,000 years. So the landscape is used to big herds of animals like cattle and sheep. And these are sometimes, this can be local herds of cattle or sheep, but mostly cattle in this region. And sometimes big nomadic herds are also present. They travel thousands of kilometers from different places, sometimes different countries, sometimes from Armenia and other places, but usually that's less lately, but there's still big nomadic herds. And for 10,000 years, livestock has been shaping the ecosystem and influencing biodiversity, of course, including butterflies. But for the last 2 years, there have been some changes in the rain regime. Usually in this region, rains start in May, June, and it is really where the June is the time when most rain comes. But for the last 2 years, they've been observing some drier springs. June is very dry. And then all of a sudden in July and August, heavy rains in summer storm rains take place, which also influences the livestock in the region and their behavior, and of course, the biodiversity. But of course, as I told you before, this is not, I'm not claiming that this is a climate change. I haven't done any scientific analysis yet, but this is the observations and what we got information from the local people. So again, if we generally summarize our fieldwork, we had 25 days of fieldwork in the region. We visited 48 locations. We have approximately 2,400 butterfly records in the region. And We recorded 177 species of butterflies, and the stars of the summer was dusky large blue Fengaris nocitos, which Irma, I'm sure, might be very interested. And Zygena armena is also, we also collected some data from the zygenid species, and that was my first time actually looking at zygenids. And this is a very local species distributed in Georgia and Turkey, and we found some new populations of both of these species. Also, we had some exciting records. These are mostly very rare species. Satyrium myrtale is one of those. It is, in this region, it is more common, but it's generally very difficult to see. Erciyes tabardina is another species we observed in this region. It is usually very rare in Turkey. There is one population that we know, and most of its population is distributed in Georgia, but we also saw this population. Polymatus cyaneus was a new record for the site we went, and also we had Satyrium ledereri. I wanted to post this species because some of them are not common in Europe, and those are very specific for our landscape. So when it comes to livestock, how people are actually finding food for their livestock has three major pathways. One of them is they actually take their animals to grazing sites, and usually villages have every family owns like 10-20 cattle, and there's a shepherd for the village, and that shepherd collects all these animals of the village, and the shepherd takes the animals for grazing, and usually they have a route, they know where the plants are, so these are very experienced shepherds making the herds move slowly to different sites to find foods. And there is also mowing very common. So usually for hay collection, there are specific sites. And these are usually very close to the villages so that villagers can go mow the hay and bring it to their homes. But recently this is changing because when people start having diesel-fueled machines like tractors and motor vehicle, they end up going to farther distances for collecting hay. Also, they plant specifically for their animals, like they plant barley, sometimes wheat and flour. And usually these are not for feeding themselves, but for the animals. And it is very important that during this very short, small 2 months, sufficient amount of food should be collected for the whole winter. And what is important here is that the ownership of the lands that they do these things differ. Usually, sites for grazing are common pastures. There is this traditionally shared sites. For example, if there's a village, all the owners know which sites they can use, and then they take their animals there for grazing. But those do not belong to them. They usually belong to the government, but it is commonly used by following either traditional sharing mechanisms, or sometimes the village heads kind of make this division. Also, mowing also usually happens in the common pastures, but when they grow wheat, barley, or clover, they're actually using their own farms. But sometimes we can see lately it is changing. They're plowing the habitats and growing either barley, wheat, or clover, depending on the availability of the water. So this is a traditional way of doing animal husbandry in the region. But recent years, there are some changes observed. For example, the sites for grazing, the herds are becoming bigger and bigger. And sometimes the mowing is usually traditionally done by hand. But recently, diesel-fueled machines are incorporated into this. So huge areas of land can be moved very quickly. And recently, many of the natural grasslands are being converted to barley, wheat, or clover production sites. So these are the changes we have been observing lately. So these are some examples, sites for grazing. This is really very nice, small amounts of animals. The number is not big, but the vegetation, as you can see, moderate to low amount of grazing. The vegetation is really rich. Mosaics of different size of vegetation you can see, and these are the places where you can actually observe really high butterfly diversity. And butterflies usually depend on this grazing, especially cattle. They are feeding selectively on the grasses, and some of the mosaics are possible. Sometimes very different species can be observed at the same time. And especially Gentiana species survive through the grazing, as cattle don't like these plants. And you can see lots of, if you dig through a little bit, you can see lots of Gentiana species with eggs on them. And there are at least 3 different species of Gentiana in the region we visited this year. So, but of course, with the herds increasing, the grazing intensity is also increasing. As you can see, this is a big flock. It is a forest opening, and big nomadic fields are grazing these habitats, and you can see the degradation on the vegetation very easily. And this is one closer look. Vegetation looks like this throughout this. There is no small shrubs or anything, and everything is heavily grazed in this region. And a high amount of grazing is observed, vegetation is degenerated, and very low butterfly diversity, at most 10 species we could observe here. But in this specific area, there was only one poor butterfly flying in this region, one species, and of course, abundance is really low. And we can see many sites lately due to overgrazing. This is, we couldn't see any of the target species. We observed 8 species in a mud puddling area, and habitat is heavily degraded. And, but when there is moderate amount of grazing, we can see butterflies, some of the examples from the moderate grazing sites. Also, there are some naturally dry meadows. Sometimes people mix this, like when a habitat is overgrazed or naturally low vegetation. So this is usually a site where people might claim that it is high grazing, but it's usually like this. And there are 20 to 30 species, and they're usually like the stone-loving species like these can be observed here. Also, there are sites spared for moving. These are common pastures, and villagers don't change the vegetation here. They let the natural vegetation grow. And then after that, they just cut the haze, either by hand or by their machinery. And then they make these piles, and they let them dry, and then take it for their for their animals to consume during winter. And the major difficulty here is that previously these were all moved by hand, but lately people are using heavy machinery here, and the whole area is usually very quickly moved, and the mosaic of the habitat is lost, and that really is very detrimental for some of the species, which includes this area. You can see that this area is previously mowed. We were there, and people were actually mowing this with little machines. They sit on it, and then they mow the area, collect plants. And then after that, herds are coming, and they graze whatever is left. And in this region, if you look a little bit closer, right here, there was this Sanguisorbo plant left, just one plant, and it was just on the edge of this flat area where it could survive. the moving. And on it, there were 2 individuals of Phangarus nocitus, and that was all. That was all. There was nothing left, and whatever plant we searched very intensively in the region. And this area was previously a big, recorded as a big numbers of Phangarus nocitus were recorded here. And all the area was moved, and maybe these animals will be able to leave some eggs and have some progeny next year. But there are really good examples of moving as well. Some of the sites with a tall vegetation were present in some of these sites. We've seen big populations of Sanguisorbo officinalis. I couldn't find a better picture showing the mosaics, but there were some sites moved, some sites grazed, some sites moderate amount of vegetation and growing. And there was a big population of Phangarus nocitus here in the 150-meter transect walk. We recorded 84 species. And on top of it, species diversity in here was really high. Also, the last part is conversion of the natural areas into agricultural sites. Usually they either plant barley, wheat, or clover. When there's water, watering mechanisms in the region, they plant clover. And this is an area, I realized I didn't take the picture of the habitat, but this was by the river, and this was an important Polyamatus merhaba habitat, which is an endangered species in Turkey. So its habitat was plowed partially, and they planted these clovers, and female Polyamatus merhaba were feeding on these clover fields, and we couldn't stay much, but that is a very interesting research question of how they're plowing, how they're converting area, and how it is influencing the populations is a very interesting question. But there is a trend of changing the vegetation, which I believe might have detrimental impacts on butterfly communities. So lastly, I want to talk a little bit about how the season is changing. Lately, for the last 2 years, the rainy season shifted from spring to summer. And spring rains are really important in this region because it is the time where all this vegetation grows and get their tall size and develop enough that people can mow and collect for their animals. And because of that, quite a lot of areas did not develop enough amount of hay to be collected. And that alarmed the local people, and they started using more areas, and they changed the behavior of their grazing path, how they were grazing and where they were taking the animals changed. They started moving the animals more into forest areas and under forest vegetation. And they also decided to change some of the natural vegetation into hand-watered grasslands. So they were changing the vegetation and planting more species. And this is also some of the influence of the drought is very significant. This is last year's picture. This is again a past record of Phangarus nocitus sites. And this was supposed to be a very wet meadow. And this year it was mostly like this and very dry. And this is how the vegetation looked like. And there were also big flocks of animals feeding on this region. And you can see that they are both dry, and then animals kind of ate whatever is left there. The plant I'm holding in my hand is a Sanguisorbo officinalis, and all the basal leaves are dry and the stems are dry and chewed and eaten. And on top of this dry situation, the influence of the livestock is very detrimental. There was no butterfly species in here in this region, which was previously recorded as a very important Phangarus nocitus habitat. So thank you. This is some of the species that we recorded from our fieldwork. Thank you for listening to me, and I'll be happy to answer questions if there's any.
Thank you so much, Evrim. It was a really interesting presentation. I really like it, and maybe there are some people, if they want to ask some questions, they could raise their hands and open the mic or put it on the chat. But yeah, really nice to see how this high biodiversity spot is somehow managed on the agriculture and the different pressures. So I was thinking on a question if nobody wants to ask, but did you have any contact with the agriculture, with the farmers there to check how the intensity of the agriculture and the moving is doing? So if they can reduce some patches or just left some parts unmown or something like that?
All the way through the field work, I actually communicate with the farmers. I mean, I was always, when I see a farmer, I was always giving time to talk with them. And in this field work, I actually didn't try to convince them to change anything because I was mostly trying to understand what they were doing. And it is really important that what they do and how they do and how it influences nature need to be recorded. And their incentives are mostly to sustain their lives. And sometimes when you talk about, you should change so that butterflies can survive, it might be very defensive in terms of nature. So I usually try to do it after like 3 or 4 field works after we get acquainted to.
No, indeed, that there is a huge competition there, no? So it's just 2 months where you need to produce all the food for the animals and for everything. At the same time, think on but the biodiversity needs a space. Yeah, it's big. Sam, you have the hand.
Yeah, great talk, Evrim. Really enjoyed that. Very, very interesting. My question was around the mowing of those areas that were seem to be mown by machinery and very extensive. Did you observe much flexibility in the timing of mowing? Because I would imagine with a very narrow summer window, the opportunity, you have to get in there and do it when you can. So I would imagine that would be worse for the butterflies if that's the case.
Mm-hmm. It's usually right after Fengaris nocitus lays their eggs. Right. So it is the wrong season for that specific butterfly. But of course, all other species might be different. What's usually happened in the past that they were hand moving and they were actually leaving those 2 critical week periods for the butterfly to survive. But what happens is that they cannot move everywhere with the machinery, heavy machinery. So it leaves some of the difficult sites like creek sites or underneath some of the trees, the butterflies some of the plants can survive there. So one advantage of using heavy machinery is that they cannot take it everywhere. While they're hand moving, they actually with that little, I don't know what it is called, that's, the tool, it's,
a sickle?
Yes, sickle. With that one, they slowly move and then they let some part of the plants to survive 2 weeks period, but also they collect everything after. So there are patches that are left. And as I told in the presentation, in just one corner, one plant survived. But again, that was just too little for that population. I don't know if they can be able to survive.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Chris?
Yeah, it was really nice, Evrim. Yeah, remembers me of the old days when we were there. But anyway, I wondered, do you know if the number of livestock really increased, or is it just that they moved to other places so you saw them more? Do you know if there are statistics on the number of cattle?
Usually I get the number from the villages. The intensity is increasing, I think, according to their saying. So this is, as I'm saying, that there is not much statistical data on this, but there is a pressure economically to increase their flocks.
Okay.
But of course, that needs to be checked. That's a very good point. Maybe they're not increasing. But I usually hear from the farmers that I ask them how many they have, and then I turn back and count, and usually it is more than what they say. So this is usually a case in my idea, because they have to report that, and they're telling us the numbers they reported, but their numbers are actually more than what they reported.
Probably have to pay tax or something on the number of cows or something like that. Okay, yeah, because it's really. Do you also know, is it just, or is also the population growing? Because in most of Europe, actually, in rural areas, people are abandoning and moving to larger cities, and then you see abandonment and encroachment and things like that. But so apparently here that's not the case.
No, actually overgrazing is becoming like a bigger problem. Erosion is increasing. On top of it, we do observe that some of the rains changes in the rain causes drought, and that puts another influence on the grazing and erosion.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Next, Irma.
Yeah, you probably expect my question already, Evrim. It's a nice talk, and so good to hear so much about Nausitaus, though it's not all positive. But my question would be whether you have already some more insight into the secret of the host ant.
No,
not yet.
Unfortunately, no. Usually when we go to the places, we barely have time to spend an hour there, and it is enough to get butterfly data, but it definitely needs to be done. And I might need you to find that and that, because the part is that what we observed here is that usually Phangarus nocitus is known to be the rarest species in this region. And because of the changes in the season, we went there in the peak season, but all alcon were gone, but everywhere we stopped, there was nocitus. We actually found like 9-10 more populations of Phangarus nocitus, and it was really unexpected. And that's strange, because sometimes within the agriculture area, there are two agricultural areas. One side is wheat, one side is barley, and there's a road, big road, and there's a tiny little bit margin of field where Sanguisorba officinalis is growing, and on top of it, within this vast area of agricultural areas, nocitus is surviving. And we found that anytime we found Sanguisorba driving through the way, we see nocitus. And that was very interesting for me, because I think the season kind of shifted and we started seeing more nocitus. It was the peak season for them. And they were even surviving in tiny populations. And that's maybe a question I might ask to you. What is the healthy population size for nocitus? Can they appear in small populations?
Yeah, it can certainly survive in small populations, and I mean it somehow what you describe resembles also a lot of my experience with the species, because they make a lot of use of metapopulation structures, so they can occur in a really loose network of just many small populations. And I guess as long as you have one or two core populations with really meadows and surfaces of habitat, then the survival even in these smaller populations is quite good. So I'm not really surprised that you have them on road verges everywhere and so. And I'm also quite sure that they are way more mobile than we think. in Nausicaa, there is always this conflict between individual behavior. They're extremely lazy. They love to spend all the day sitting on a sanguisorba and just making very short flights and going back to the sanguisorba and just more or less doing nothing. But once they start to disperse, they can cover distances. And I'm in a kilometer of 5 to 8 and even more has been recorded even with marked butterflies. So I think they are quite able to keep up mobile networks and survive in a kind of dynamic landscape.
It might be good to add that I think that what Evrim now sees in Turkey is what we see everywhere in Europe. If you go to Germany, Nausicaa follows the road verges, and so it's and small everywhere, small pockets of 10, 20 meters where you find them, and then so this is it starts more to look like Europe on that one.
It's way more beautiful.
Yeah.
No, it's a different league, I admit.
It's really different.
Great, thank you so much for your questions. I don't know if there are any others from the audience. If not, thank you so much for joining. I think it was really interesting, Efrin, and we were recently talking about how agriculture is affecting the biodiversity and especially butterflies. So I think it's a trending topic that we need to continue investigating and see how we can keep this balance, no? Of course, feeding people, but at the same time preserving our biodiversity and the pressure on butterflies. So yeah, I'm super happy to have this talk to put it in our channel, in BCE YouTube channel. So then we could check it many times as we want, and then, yeah, continue referring to this. So thank you so much, Efrim, for doing the talk today.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be here.
It was really nice. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining. It was great. And I hope to see you in 2 weeks. We have Irma talking a really interesting talk. Is the time for the woman now. So yeah, thank you so much.